Hello, friends, and welcome back to another author talk episode of the Reading Rule Y'all podcast. I'm Dr. Chea Parton, and this is where we talk about all things rural living, YA literature, and to the rural writers who write it. This episode, I'm talking to Regina M. Hansen, author of The Coming Storm, and this conversation was so good I totally forgot what questions I meant to ask. Instead, we just had a conversation about everything from how to read the natural world where we're from, the ways we've attempted to be good rural moms by helping our children connect to the earth around us wherever we are. We talk about being rural and urban as a type of dual citizenship. We talked about the role of folklore and its connection to place, especially rural places. We talked about the need for a rural designation in publishing, and her advice to writers just absolutely gave me chills. So I'm so excited for you to join our conversation. And without further ado, let's get to the episode. Hey, friends, and welcome back to Reading Rule Y'all. I am so excited that you're with us today because you're in for a treat. Today, I get to talk with author Regina Hansen about her 2021 release, The Coming Storm. Regina Hansen is the author of the young adult supernatural novel, The Coming Storm, and a nominee for the 2022 Red Maple and Mythopoeic Awards.
Yep.
Regina teaches at Boston University and has written and edited scholarly essays and books on many topics, including monsters, Halloween, horror movies, elves, angels, demons, and Christmas stories. She's the co-author with Jeffrey Weinstock of Giving the Devil His Due, Satan and Cinema, nominated for the Bram Stoker Award, and co-editor with Susan George of Supernatural, Humanity, and the Soul, The Highway to Hell and Back, which sounds amazing. She is also author-editor of Roman Catholicism and Fantastic Film. She likes to sing, read, and crochet, and walk the beaches of New England and Eastern Canada. She lives in Massachusetts with her husband and 3 children. Welcome, Regina. It's so wonderful to have you on the podcast today.
Hi, we were just chatting before, but nice to talk to you still.
So we'll start with my first question, which is my obsession. It's what I want to know about everybody I meet, and that is, where are you from, and how has that impacted who you are as both a person and a writer?
So I was born on Prince Edward Island, Canada, which is Eastern Canada. It's the smallest province in Canada, home of Anne of Green Gables, some people know. And I lived there till I was 5, but then we moved to Montreal. But I spent every summer with my grandparents in the town of Georgetown, Prince Edward Island, which is under a different name, basically where the novel is set. And, and then from Montreal, we moved to Boston, which is where my mother's from. There's a long-term connection between New England and the maritime provinces of Canada, and my mother and father, I am the result of that connection. I think it might be important to say, because I lived with my grandparents, as opposed to sort of being a cottager, and there's nothing wrong with being a cottager is great. It was a sort of situation where I felt a connection to the area that maybe I wouldn't have if I saw it as my vacation place. It really felt like home to me. And I will say that when we moved, when I was 5, my grandfather, who I adored, I still remember this. He said, "Well, you're always from Prince Edward Island. That's where you're from." So, it's something that I carry with me, even though I've lived in the city for much of my life.
And so how do you think that, or how do you see that movement and being from these different places? How do you feel like that shapes the stories you tell, the kind of stories you tell, who you are as a writer?
Well, so I think the island connection, first of all, because it was a chance to, I don't know, there's a sort of a peacefulness of a rural existence, and there are difficulties with a rural existence, and I know we should get that out of the way and make sure we recognize that, but there's also a peacefulness to the rural existence, an ability to pay attention. Spending all those summers sort of sitting on a swing or walking on the dirt road or sitting on the beach, or I mean, I know the names of plants that other people don't know the names of, and I know the names of what birds sound like, and I know, that kind of stuff that you might not pay. And my kids, I tell them now, will walk by a wildflower and I say, so what's that called? And sort of ask them to sort of repeat it to me. And that really helps. So I have sort of, I have a sense of the urban world and the details of the urban world, but I also have a large sense of the details and natural details of the rural world, which is the world, right? The rural world existed before the urban world. And so it helps me to understand the full world and not just, the streets of the city.
Yeah, and so I think that that definitely makes a difference in world building. And I was
Yes.
thinking as you were talking, the similarities between the experiences that you had living with your grandparents and growing up on Prince Edward Island, and the Boston connection, like all of that really exists in The Coming Storm in a real way. And so I think, you know, I think writers can write more than what they know because they can do research.
Yeah.
But I think that there's something about telling stories that's so deeply connected to where we're from and who we're from and what that looks like. And I love that the mention of when you grow up in a rural place, you sort of become a watcher.
Yeah.
And I think that you see that in quite a few of the characters in the book as well. They're very observant. They notice things and contemplate those noticings in a way that I think that there are probably watchers in cities too.
Oh, sure.
But I think when you grow up in the country, there's just something about paying attention to the natural world that doesn't exist in the same way in an urban environment.
Well, I think you'd enjoy this very, at this point, very old essay called Rain and the Rhinoceros by Thomas Merton. By the way, he was a Catholic monk, and he talked about solitude,
Hmm.
and that it wasn't that people were bad and that the world was bad, and it was that, but sometimes you just needed to go and sit someplace alone. And like you say, you can do that in the city too, but it's harder. Sit in a natural place alone and observe, like the Desert Fathers, or like Thoreau, or just sort of get that chance to know who you are, in a sense, because you've been alone with yourself, without advertisements and without other people, hundreds and hundreds of other people a day telling you who you are.
Right.
And that is, that ability stems from one of the things that rural life offers. It also offers gossip and complete lack of solitude, but it can offer a kind of a solitude that you can miss in other places.
Yeah. And I think even that gossip can be helpful.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, if everybody knows everybody, then everybody knows what everybody else needs
That's
and
correct.
knows how to be helpful. When I do these, it's so fun to talk to other like rural people, especially rural out migrants, because
Yeah,
I'm constantly still trying to understand myself and the things that I do.
sure.
And even when we lived in Texas, we lived in a large subdivision, but there was a
Right.
nice little trail that like ran by the culvert, like the ditch.
Right.
There were always grackles back there. Texas does a really great job of just letting the wildflowers flourish. So like
Yeah.
every April there was blue bonnets, and then the Indian blankets and the Mexican hats, and the like all of these flowers. And there was kind of, we lived there long enough to where we recognized like this one's going to come first and this one's going to, and then it
Right.
was weird if like the blue bonnets were blooming earlier than what they were supposed to,
Right.
or if things were coming at the same time, and it didn't usually happen that way. And so my oldest is 4.5, and she loves to name things. She loves to
Yeah.
know the names of things. And so if I didn't know the name of a flower, because like I wasn't from there, we would look it
Yeah.
up and we would point it out and, oh, there
Right.
it is. And, oh, do you see the cardinals? Oh, the lady cardinal, she's brown, but the male cardinal, he's red. And
Yeah.
and we saw the same two every day. And so she just like, she would pick that stuff up. And now in the subdivision that we live, there's also a trail that goes over a creek. And
Yeah.
but there's like, there's hogweed and there's Queen Anne's lace, and so I'm
Right.
like naming these things, and we saw a turtle, and I think, yeah. And so like, so she has picked up on that, and she will ask questions like, oh mama, what's that one? Oh mama, what's that one? If I don't know, we'll look it up or whatever. And so I think I sometimes worry about how connected they'll be to the earth.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
we are on the farm, which is why I send them to my mom's, because my
Yeah.
mom still has a very large garden, and they help her plant flowers and they pick strawberries. And I hope she makes them pick green beans so they can feel what that feels like in their legs and their back, you know.
Yeah. No kidding.
Um, and then they snap them together and they tell stories and all
Yeah.
of the things that I did. Not that if they, come up different than me, that's bad, because
Right.
it's still going to be them. It's going to be how they build themselves. But I think I just learned so many great things from all of the things that I got to do, all of the things that I was made to do,
Absolutely.
growing
Absolutely.
up on the farm. And so I want that for them too. And I think it's kind of selfish, but at the same time, like, I just think they were good lessons.
No, I think you're right. And I do. I try to teach them that. Like I said, I told you, I think before the recording started, my daughter, she's learned to make biscuits because that's what they have on the island. Oh, someone's coming over. I have to make some biscuits for them. And so she's learned to make all kinds of different, she's got, when my grandmother passed away,
Mhm.
we had the recipe box. And so I printed it up and I sent it out to like my cousins and everybody. And then the person who most has embraced the recipe box is my daughter, Angelina, and she tries different things from it, and just it's her way to feel connected.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
but I was thinking it's very interesting because so like my other side is Italian, and a lot of Italian Americans obviously moved to the cities,
Right.
but they had mostly come from the country.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's really interesting because what happens is that they try to make their little country, they always have a garden, a
Yes.
beautiful, and the Portuguese Americans as well always have a garden. And like my great grandfather had this garden that he sold his tomatoes. He had so many tomatoes that he could sell them. But people do, I feel like it doesn't matter what kind of rural environment that you come from. It could be a far away, like my old landlord was from Nigeria, and he had a garden. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
It or wanted like more green space. Like they wherever you're coming from, immigrants and things like that, a lot of times people came to the cities, not just as you say, out migrants from American or Canadian rural areas, but also immigrants coming from rural areas all over the world, and they try to in some ways replicate a little bit of the best of the rural environment that they lived in, if they're lucky enough to be able to purchase a home or whatever. Like that's why you see flowers on everybody's balcony, and that's what I just find that interesting.
Yeah, yeah. Um, Everybody wants to feel at home.
Yes, everybody wants to feel at home, and isn't it interesting for so many people how home has to have green things
Yeah,
and living things
yeah.
that don't talk?
Right. All of that movement, I think, helps us build our identities in really interesting
Yes.
ways. And then obviously our personal identity influences our professional identities, whether that be
Yes.
teachers, whether that be writers, and we
Yeah.
make decisions based on those experiences. And I feel like talking to you now and hearing these stories, I can totally see that in The Coming Storm. And so I'm curious, when you were writing The Coming Storm, did you see that as a rural book? And how or why was rurality important to you in the context of Beat's story?
So it's so funny because I remember hearing from you a while back, and you're the first person to officially call it a rural book, and then when of course it's a rural book. I think that and I've loved that and embraced it ever since. I think I thought of it as a book of the sea and a book about music and a book about home, but we just talked about rurality and home a minute ago, so that makes sense. And just a book about someone who lives in comparative isolation, but yet still has a strong community. And a book that grows from the myth and folklore of the area, and so it was very much place-based. So how could it not be rural? Because it's a rural place. But I don't know if I ever, to be honest, until you called it that, which I love and embrace, I don't think I thought of it in those terms. I mean, I thought of it, and not in no, wrong way. Clearly thought of it in those terms because everything about it is rural. But I don't think I knew how to name it. And that it has special rural flavor, but obviously it does. And and I'm very proud of that, and I'm very proud to have had it named that, because it's coming from that experience. And I will say that the people who have responded the best to it are the people from the town that it's supposed to have grown from, and that was hugely important to me. Which I think is all part of the question you're asking. One of my things was this is going to come out, and they're all going to be like, oh, she doesn't know what she's talking about. Oh, well, she's just like romanticizing it. And everybody has been so like, oh, read this book, or reminds me of this, or reminds me, and also, or we like that you use everybody's names, but not for the right people, or and I use kinds of similar stories, but I very specifically didn't use the exact folklore that I heard, because it's not mine to use. So I use kind of folklore that might have been similar, that kind of stuff. And it was successfful with the people of the area.
Yeah, I
They
can
liked
imagine
it,
how nerve-wracking that would be.
it was very nerve-wracking.
Sure.
And so I guess it earned its rural credibility, which made me extremely, extremely happy. I'm trying to think, there was one other thing about that. Well, I'll come back to it if I remember. But yeah, so no, like I said, you're calling it that. I feel like it elevated my work in a way that I am truly appreciative of.
Oh, well, thank you. So I think one of the issues is that like publishers don't use, there's lots of urban fiction.
Yes, urban fantasy, right?
There's urban everything.
Yeah.
But there's not rural anything.
No.
So, even like, and it's so frustrating to me. Which is why I started calling rural books, because they
Right.
are.
Yes, they are.
And it's important to call them that, because when like my former students at the rural school where I taught, or even me as a rural kid, walks into a bookstore or a library.
Yes.
If we want a story that reflects our lived experiences, how are we going to find it? Even a lot of the descriptions of books that I've read and that are definitely rural don't say.
Well, I'll tell you why. Here's an interesting thing. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but this is really, really interesting. Years ago, and this made me so mad, and I'm thinking of now all the rural books, from Charlotte's Web, which is considered the most important children's book, like whatever, right? Through Anne of Green Gables and all those other books, and these and books from now as well, that that just are never called rural, right? And I'm really sorry that I interrupted you, but I think this is really important. I remember hearing a writer say, they were asked, and I won't name them, but they were asked, what ideas are going to go out of children's literature? What ideas are not going to be important in the future? And what the person said was farming. Too many farms. That lifestyle is gone. Nobody, that's irrelevant to the present time. And I was just like, I got so mad, and again, and I really am a dual citizen, urban, rural dual citizen. So I appreciate and love the urban environment for what it has to offer, but don't be telling me, so that I didn't like, I really, when you were talking, it's not only, it seems to me that it's not only that it's not there for the kids to find, but they purposely don't think it should be there for the kids to find, or labeled, or that if you call it this, people don't call it. And I'm not saying this is not how my publishers are fantastic and would label it whatever they, it's not them, but in a general sort of capitalistic sense, this is not a world that matters to anybody.
Yeah.
Enough to label it.
Right. And I had a conversation with Melissa Wyatt on this podcast, actually, where she was talking about her book, Funny How Things Change, which takes place in Appalachia. It's very working class focused. And she was talking about sort of, going into the war room with one of the folks working on her book, because they wanted the story to be changed so that the main character goes to college, because if he doesn't, that's not the stuff of hero making literature. And which implies, right, that like nobody's going to buy it. And also sort of implied this like working class rural people don't read and aren't going to book anyway. They don't have the money to buy this book, or they're not going to read it. Like there's a lot of like stuff like buried in this conversation that she had with this person. And like that's frustrating to me because like I mean one of my grandpa's most cherished and prized possession was a book of poetry that he read so much that it was falling apart.
Mm.
You know, and my uncle Leroy loves westerns, and my great grandpa couldn't read, but my great grandmother read to all of them and would read books. And my great grandpa was always super excited whenever they would get a new book so that he could hear a new story. Like,
Yeah. My
um,
grandmother was the school secretary and librarian for her town, and she taught me to read. She was like, "You don't know how to read yet? We're going to take care of that this summer." So I completely with you.
yeah,
Yeah.
and so then it's just like it's really frustrating because especially books that are like wildly successful, like Jeff Zentner's In the Wild Light, if that
Yeah.
were marketed as a rule book, like what would that do to sort of the sort of sense of somebodyness that rural kids have, that like
Yeah.
stories that are like theirs really matter and are
Yeah.
having this, I hate that it's tied to capitalistic stuff, but like that
Yeah.
are having this success,
Yeah.
like people are reading this rural story and they're enjoying it and it's winning all of these awards because it's so
Yeah.
wonderfully written, and there are so many rural books that are like that are, and like The Coming Storm, they're so great. The stories are so enjoyable to read. They're also very nuanced and authentic depictions of what people go through. I mean, I didn't
Yeah.
grow up on a coastal rural region, so like I learned a lot about like what rural people,
Yep.
what their lives were like, you know, on the coast from reading your book. But there was also still things that I recognized about my own rural experience, where Beat knows where her dad is, like in what field, what part of the field,
Yeah.
what because of what part of the year it is.
Yeah.
And so like I just think I just am so mad that like Charlotte's Web and books like that are so old are still like the
Yeah.
only, or like Where the Red Fern Grows, like that
Where
was
the
the
wind.
one my students really loved.
Yeah. It's so depressing. But
Well, and what's funny about the mention of Charlotte's Web is that as a kid I hated
yeah.
that book, and I
Yeah.
told my
Well,
teachers, I was like, this is stupid.
yeah.
Wilbur would go to processing whether
Yeah.
Charlotte wanted him to or not, because Fern has to eat, like, but we
Yeah.
raised hogs, and so like
Yeah. Yeah. That's right.
and
Yeah. Of
so
course.
like even like as a rural perspective, as a representation of
Yeah.
reality, it's not really that accurate or authentic,
No.
because I mean it's a fantasy book really.
Right. Of course it is.
um
Yeah. Yeah.
so I guess maybe in an alternate reality that might be something that happened, but like, and my teachers were like that was a very unpopular opinion, and they were like, Chea,
Yeah.
that's not what you're supposed to get from this book. And I'm like, well, I mean, I was talking to my papa about it, and we both agreed like this is stupid
It
because
wouldn't. Yeah.
this family has to eat. This is the way
Yeah.
this family makes money. They're not gonna spare this pig because of some spell and spider.
Yeah.
Um. So anyway, I just think we need this category of publishing.
Yeah.
My students needed it. My students, especially sort of my readers who were sick of reading stories that were windows. Like
Yeah.
a window is good, but it takes some balance. And
Yeah.
if my students never got to read about lives that looked like theirs, which they wanted to. I mean, I had sophomore boys ask me if they could read Where the Red Fern Grows Again, because they loved that book and it made them cry because they
Yeah.
love their hunting dogs, and it made them think of their
Yeah.
right, like they could connect it to their own experience. And that
Absolutely.
needs to happen for rural students. And if we don't have a way for teachers to find rural books, and we don't have a way for
Right.
readers to find rural books, then an entire like quarter
Yeah.
of the US population is missing out on finding books for them.
I
um
think that's very important. And again, in a rural book, I mean, the book, and I am so sorry that I do not remember the name of the author now, but I'll look for it and you can add it. The book that actually won the Mythopoeic award the last year when I was nominated is called Root Magic, and it's about the Sea Islands. And it's sort of and it's in some ways I would love to meet this author, because it's in some ways very similar, sort of like about folklore and myth, but of like different group of people, so the Gullah people of the Sea Islands. And then there's also, there are books about indigenous people, right? And then there are books that it's important to call them by many of the things that they are, but to also call them rural, because what happens then, what I find is people have an imagination of what the rural world is. Like in my book, There are people who are descended from Lebanese people who came over. There are, very briefly, indigenous people. There are French people. They're like, you know what I'm saying? There's like
Yeah.
a rural.
It's diverse.
It's a the rural. That's what I'm trying to get. The rural world, the rural setting is a diverse setting, and I think part of it may be that you say rural and you think one thing.
Yeah.
And that's just ridiculous, because lots of people of color, BIPOC people throughout the rural world, and living similar. It would bring, I think, it would bring people of all those groups together to know that they share, kids especially. Look, what we have in common is that we have the things that we've been talking about, the ability to sit for a while and observe things. You know what I mean? The air, the whatever it is, the gossip, whatever it is, that whatever the magical thing is that characterizes rural identity, is shared across many different kinds of cultures within the United States and Canada, certainly. But calling it rural, sort of, people hear rural and they think one thing.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. I mean, there's this single story of rural places as a white monolith of conservative, racist, homophobic people beating their Bibles and brandishing their guns in a yard that has a Confederate flag in it, and like, that's just not 100% true. I mean, it's and Chimamanda Adichie talks about how stereotypes aren't dangerous because they're untrue. They're dangerous because they're incomplete, right? Like, that's not the whole story of rural America. And so, which is why the Whippoorwill exists, which is why I'm on that committee, which is why I created Literacy in Place. And I'm trying to find books that represent all of these diverse, populations. I mean, it still really grinds my gears that no one ever talks about how Bell Hooks was from a rural place. Everyone did. Always,
She talked about
100%. She did. Yes.
I love
But when I was in my my education classes, when you read people who are writing about her, theorizing and about her work, nobody ever talks about her as a rural person, as a rural Black person. They always only talk about her as a Black woman, right? And so what you're saying about, like, the layering of rural identities, the fact that if we focus on one thing that a person is, or one identity marker, we miss out on so much of who that person was and what their story means to the larger conversation that's happening about all of these different experiences and different identities. And so I think, I mean, I'll get off my soapbox, but like, this is why I do this work, right? Like, this is why I am so passionate about this, because I had kids of color in my rural high school when I went to school. There were kids of color in the high school that I taught at. And their story is largely erased because of this single story. And also, when we only focus on this one sort of problematic population, we do a disservice to all of the other people who sort of meet some of those,
absolutely. And it's so interesting.
Markers,
No, absolutely. And it's so interesting because so I had different friends, living here in Massachusetts. And so I would go home to Prince Edward Island in the summer, but then I had a Salvadoran friend go to El Salvador. They called it their country, by which they meant both the country they were from, but also it was the country, like, And then I had a Black friend who would go, their family was from Alabama. She'd go there for the summer. People would send their kids out of the city. I don't know if you know this experience or not. It's a very common experience when I'm a little bit older than you, but in my experience, where people who had family in rural areas would send their children out of the hot city in the summer to some place that was cooler and safer and surrounded by family. And I had many friends from all kinds of different backgrounds who had that experience of the child who was a sort of rural expat, or whose grandparents still lived there, and you'd be sent away, and that's, so you had this dual identity. And it was common amongst kids of all races and all backgrounds, and coming from all national identities, that they would be sent to the country, and it could be El Salvador, or it could be Prince Edward Island.
Yeah. That's really,
Yeah.
I'm glad that you mentioned that. It's so interesting because in my reading for the Whippoorwill Award, a lot of the times I sort of get frustrated because there are a lot of these books where kids come from the city
Yeah.
because of some problem or some issue that
Right.
happens. Then they
Yeah.
like, they go stay with their grandparents or
Right.
their great aunts and
Yeah.
uncles or, whatever. Um, and it's sort of like, well, why aren't we just focusing on the people who are already living there?
Already there.
um,
Already there. Yeah, of
but
course. Yeah.
but it also makes sense because that is a cultural practice of outmigrants who are now
Right.
living in cities to send, which I am now engaging in that same practice. I send my kids to go plant flowers and be in
Right.
the garden with my mom, and they
Yeah.
go down the road and they feed the cows, and they, and so I am now engaging in that practice. And so thank you for saying that, because that has formulated a whole new like synapse connection and way of thinking in my brain that I didn't have before. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
really helpful actually to me.
Uh,
Thank you for
no,
talking.
you're, but I also see your point of view, because it can be said, and I was like, and I was changed so much by my experience with these strange people.
Yeah,
That's not great.
no,
I totally, but at the same time, it is a experience of so many kids, and I don't know if it's generationally quite true as much as it was before, but certainly my generation, it was very common, and it was a way that actually, in some ways, we were close to each other, became friends, because we knew we wouldn't see each other in the summer, because
right. Everybody's going someplace different.
everybody's going someplace different.
Yeah.
So yeah, I appreciate your point of view on that as well. I definitely see what you're saying, is that's sort of, I'm going to save this ignorant place, or I'm going to learn so much from these people, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Whatever it is, that's not great.
Yeah.
I can see why you would respond negatively to that.
Yeah. Yeah. But at the same time, like, it's helpful to have something to sort of I don't know, like frame my thinking in a way that isn't only mad,
Yeah.
about it, to sort of
No,
understand why it happens and why it exists.
why it exists. Yeah, exactly. It is, it's so weird just to think about place and identity, right? Um, that you're from this place, but then you also have a language. There's all, different, there's all kinds of different ways in which people, I went to French school when I lived in Montreal, and a French perspective is, if you speak French, you're French, you know, and Prince Edward Island perspective is, you're born here, you're from, and actually it's a New England thing too. If you're born in New England, you're a New Englander. It doesn't matter how long ago you left, I don't know if it's true enough, so places that have an identity, that surpasses the various different groups of people that live within that place. I find that kind of interesting, like New England as a place, Prince Edward Island, like the Maritimes as a place, the rural sort of, Appalachia as a place. That's an identity that I don't know if it supersedes, but it embraces all other identities within that area. And I find that, to me, very fascinating.
Yeah. I think that's true of Texas too. Like, if you're born in Texas, if you're born on Texas soil, then you're Texan. Which I can't bring myself to call my kids Texan.
my brother-in-law is a Texan, and so my sister, my little niece is half Texan.
And I'm glad that you brought up language, because this is another thing that's really fascinating to me, and something that I think about a lot, like rural language varieties. In your book, it's more of the sisters putting on that Boston, that sort of Bostonian accent, and the beat, and other people in the story see it as kind of putting on airs a little bit.
Yeah.
But then also the appreciation of the Bostonian accent from somebody who actually is there and is living on the island. But I think that's also really important to think about the way that language connects us to place, and that, in my work, that rural language varieties, that they're not just incorrect English,
No, absolutely.
And that I wish teachers, especially English teachers, would start having more conversations about that.
Right.
But I definitely appreciated that part of the book, and how it helps readers think about the way that language connects people to places.
Well, I appreciate it, because I really thought hard about the language and how Beat would talk, and her use of especially her use of simile
Mm-hmm.
throughout, and because that's just, I mean, my father would sit there and go, oh, they're all old as a boot, or what, they're those kinds of expressions. And I was actually, I toned it down because I was told no one's going to believe that they talk. I'm like, well, okay, but they actually say all those expressions. But I had to cut out, like, by my first readers. By the time it got to the publisher, it had been toned down. But my first readers were like, no one's going to believe people talk like that.
But they
You know,
do, and like
but
that's
they
the thing
do.
that really frustrates me. Like rural people are the best simile people you
Well,
can
it's so
ever find.
clever. That's what I mean. It's so the
Yeah.
verbal cleverness of it is so, it's like you have to think fast to come up with that, you
Well,
know?
and like you'd ask my papa, like, Papa, how you doing today? I'm fine in frog hair. Like, yeah, because frogs, he's so fine. Frogs don't have hair,
Yeah,
so
so there you go.
but yeah, I mean, there are all kinds of, and some of them are unsavory and off color,
Yes.
and some of them are a little bit safer. But yes, like that's an entire like part of rural language variety that I think, I wasn't sure if it was just like my family, but the more I talk to other rural people, the more I'm realizing it, like that rural similes are just like part of the language.
They are.
I once told somebody, I can't remember. I think I had a pen go out or something in a class, and I was like, man, this pen's worthless as tits on a board. And the girl sitting next to me was like, what?
What is
And I was like, this pen is useless now. It's worthless as tits on a board. And she was
it?
like, what does that mean? And I was like, sows
And
feed that they
spores
go
are
in.
guys.
Boars don't use theirs,
Yeah.
they're useless.
Ah.
And so then she finally got it, but she obviously wasn't from a farm,
Right.
culture, wasn't from a rural place.
Yeah.
But there are
Clumsy
so
as a bag of
many like that.
hammers. Yeah. No,
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
so many things like that.
Yeah. I'm not
Um,
entirely sure why a wet hen is mad, but I guess anybody
Is
would be
that
mad if they
right?
got.
Yeah. Well, because so we had chickens.
Yeah, sure.
And we had a mister set up for them
Yeah.
because we had them in Texas. And we lost to one season because it was like 113 degrees.
Yeah.
And we didn't have like a good misting situation set up, and they had
Yeah.
some shade, but it wasn't enough. And so we redid our setup, and we set up a mister, and they loved that thing. Like they would go
Yeah. Yeah.
all the
Yeah.
time.
So like, why
They
are
weren't mad about
they
being
not
let
mad
at
at
all.
all? Yeah. It's well, also I think, rural similes also reflect, like, so in Italian, you hear a lot of Italian Americans will say things like skeeve or scutch, right? And those come from Italian words, but they're urban words. You hear them more likely to hear them in the city because that's where more Italian Americans live. But so they come from the place the words come from the place where these people came from. And I think that's part of what's interesting about, for some of the people that settled these rural areas also brought some of their words from wherever they originally came. We forget that the people who settled rural areas, unless they're indigenous, actually did come from somewhere else originally. And so they also there's two things going on. There's the continuation of linguistic patterns that come from wherever the people came from, but then there's also just inventiveness. And both of those things are beautiful and important to the language,
Yeah.
I was just thinking of a custom. Some of the things, I think another thing is, because things happen in rural areas, and this is important to my book because it's got so much to do with folklore, I think, and it's not really, this is like a tangent, but I hope you don't mind. I do a lot of talking about Halloween. People talk to me, call me and ask me about the history of Halloween. I don't know why it became a thing that I started to know about, probably because I'm really interested in how folklore works in culture. And, a lot of the things in Halloween are sort of passed down, or the traditions of Halloween are passed down verbally. They're passed down. No one ever wrote down, this is what happened here. we think it might have come from this, but we can't really prove exactly where all of our Halloween traditions come from, or all of our Christmas traditions, our holiday traditions. We assume many of them are hundreds and hundreds of years old, but we don't know for sure. And because you don't have a book that tells you like where these traditions came from, or a book that tells you where these expressions came from, so I guess that's the connection, we don't think is good enough. And I remember this because when my uncle is on Facebook with me, he's so cute, my Uncle Stuart, and I put a picture up of a turnip that I made into a jack-o'-lantern. I said, look, old school Celtic, I made a turnip from a jack-o'-lantern, thinking this is something that no one did anymore. He comes on and he says, we used to do that every year. Was my favorite thing about Halloween was we did turnip jack-o'-lanterns. And I was like, well, there's your proof, people who need the book. Here's my uncle, he's 80 years old. He did turnip jack-o'-lanterns. That tradition came over with his, his Celtic, his Scottish ancestry. He brought it over and they did turnip jack-o'-lanterns. That's trust the people. And and that may also be a little bit about the sort of maybe dismissal of rurality a little bit in literature, is that the patterns, the speech patterns, the folklore and stuff like that. Although in some case it was sort of gathered and stolen, as we know, there's a whole other podcast you could do on that. In other cases, it only exists because people pass it down to one another.
Right. Oral traditions are hugely important. In Appalachia, there are the Jack stories.
Yeah.
And so a lot of Appalachian traditions come from the Jack stories. And so there's one about Halloween that jack-o'-lanterns are called jack-o'-lanterns because of something that happened in a Jack story, right? And because it happened to Jack, it became a jack-o'-lantern.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Well, and these little stories, like the stories, that are in the novel, like I said, I changed them because they belong to other people, but people, people think that folklore is no longer existing. There's only urban myth that exists now. But, which is a separate thing, the hitchhiker, all that stuff, right?
Yeah.
But exactly. But there are ghost stories of people who, saw someone in the window and it turned out that they were actually dead 100 miles away. Like, people still tell those stories now, and they certainly told them when I was a child. I mean, I think cable TV and internet maybe doesn't help those things survive, but certainly well into my adulthood, these kinds of stories were still being passed down orally and not being written down.
When I was reading the book, I just felt like it was so refreshing to me, your approach to including folklore in the book, and how it serves as like a really important foundation, and that people don't just tell people who are like sort of sharing stuff that they're stupid, that they're like, that they believe one another and they sort of like go with one another to investigate and to figure out what's going on. And when I was reading it, it made me think a little bit of, and I don't know if you've read this, but V.E. Schwab's The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue.
No, but I want to.
So there's a very similar kind of origin story where there is a being, and there's sort of like a deal made with a being, and and so anyway, there are some connections there, and it's not a perfect corollary, obviously.
Sure, no, well,
but I'm starting to realize how much I love folklore and the way that it exists in the books that I read, and it's not something that I really ever gravitated toward. But I read The Gathering Dark, an anthology of folk horror. I read, and it was amazing, and it won a Whippoorwill. But I'm just realizing how important folklore is to me, and the things that and the work that I do. And I just really, I feel like I learned, because it's a different approach to the sea siren, right? So I mean, I took like classics and learned about the sirens of Greek mythology and all of that stuff, but like and Circe and whatever. But this is different in really important ways, and I just appreciated the way that it just was real, that it
Oh, thank you.
yeah, that it was real, and that everyone acknowledged that it was real, and there were no naysayers really who were like, you're stupid beat, like what's wrong with you.
Yeah.
um but I
They
think
accepted it from tradition because tradition
right,
suggested these things were possible. Yeah.
right, and I think that
Yeah.
makes the magic, and like I just feel like that makes the magic real. It makes it stronger, it makes it feel like, I don't know how to explain that. I don't have words for it, but I loved it.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, I think, it's funny because the author, Charles DeLint, who I love, if you've never read him, he's fantastic. He's a Canadian author. And he's one of the sort of main first writers of what they call urban fantasy, which is basically there's a city, there's a real place, and these, I know but these sort of fantastical creatures interact with us just as if they existed. And he was the one who sort of embraced the term mythopoeic fantasy, which means that doesn't just happen in the city. In fact, I mean, maybe even more other places. It happens everywhere. It happens. And so it happens on Prince Edward Island, and it happens in Appalachia, and it happens in the Sea Islands, and wherever that you can live a life, and it's different from magical realism. You can live a realistic life in which there are beliefs and thoughts and folklore that you interact with. Could be true, right? What's his name? Okay, I'm going to Salman Rushdie.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
He said, he's an atheist, and this is not about religion, but it's related. He's an atheist, and he said, well, I don't believe in God, but I come from a country where millions and millions of people believe in millions and millions of gods, and they're alive to them. And what am I going to say to that? What am I? And I feel like that's sort of the way I look at Beats world, and in general, the worlds I try to write about is could be true. People have thought this for a long time and interacted with the world as if it were true. You go to Iceland, they have the little elf houses, and you can recognize it as myth. Myth, another term, myth has a lot of meanings, but one of the meanings that I like best for it is sacred story. So it's something that you live with as part of your being, and without it, you'd be sorry.
Mm-hmm.
A world that doesn't have that magic in it, that sense of the sense of mythic purpose and potential in it is kind of boring, honestly, I feel. And again, I think Beats World and the rural world has that it should be recognized as a place that has that potential.
And this is really fascinating to me because so a while ago, I haven't read the third one, but Rainbow Rowell has the Simon Snow series. And in the second book, they come to America, and they can't use their magic in rural places because they talk about how magic is like energy that comes from people. And so wherever
Right.
there's the greatest concentration of people, then that's where the most magic is going to be.
Yeah.
And when I read about that, I remember not liking it. But I couldn't really figure out why. And so now as you're talking, I'm thinking about how like magic does exist in rural places. Magic does exist in rural people, for rural people. And so I think that one of the reasons that I loved your book so much is that it really puts that on display, that like, even though there aren't, a huge concentration of people, like there are in urban fantasy books or in, Carry On Simon Snow or whatever, magic still exists in those places and in those people and for those places and for those people. And a huge way that it does that is through folklore. And so, yeah.
Well, and the people that, I mean, I don't know, all these stories came from somebody who still exists because the story still exists.
Right.
So that doesn't that populate the world?
Mm.
Where you think there's nobody, actually there's all these people that came before who told this story.
Yeah. And I think that shows up in a big way too. And I don't want to give any spoilers, but I think that shows up in a big way too in the book, especially towards the end. So if you haven't read it yet, listeners, go get it and read it because it's amazing.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it so much.
And the cover also is absolutely gorgeous. Like,
that is Tran Win, and her Instagram is My Name is Tran. Fantastic, and has won some awards for fantasy comforts in the past.
Yeah, it's absolutely gorgeous. Actually, Rob Costello is the person who recommended that I read the book. And when I got it in the mail, I was like, oh, this is really good. because we do judge books by their covers.
It was exactly what I dreamed about, and when I saw it, I was like,
yeah, it makes me, every time I look at it, it makes me think of the drawings that that are done of Beat in the way that they're described in the book and stuff. So anyway, it was perfect, I think, and both were gorgeous. How are we doing on time? Oh, we probably should.
Well, if you have one more question, if you have something else you needed to wrap up.
I mean, we've just been having such a great conversation.
I know.
I forgot about my questions. I guess I always ask what advice you might have for rural young people or rural teachers who want to pursue writing either as like a serious hobby, a side hustle, or a career.
All right. So, there's always the obvious read and write. Everybody said that, and that's true. But I would also say, think about yourself as a writer before you are published. You're a writer now, whoever you are, however old you are, whatever you're doing as your other job, or assuming that you might do eventually as your job, you are also a writer now. And find ways to feel like that. And it depends on where you live. Maybe you like to write outside, go sit under a tree with a journal and write, you know what I mean? Or if you like to be around people and there's a library nearby or whatever, go to library and write, sit in, make a special part of your room. That's your writing place. Whatever the thing is that will make you, start to maybe, I don't know, either subscribe or go to the library to get the writers' journals that they have, whatever it is that's going to make you feel like I'm a writer. Read books about other writers that are from, especially like if you're rural, there are wonderful people like Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings, or who have a beautiful book about her life, that writing the beautiful books about when she was writing The Yearling, or Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, right? Or there's all kinds of books, and you probably have better ones than I probably just gave you stupid ones, but no, I like them. But find books about rural writers who have your experience. What did they do? What were the patterns of their life that make you think, oh, that's how they're being a writer, and do those things to make yourself realize and recognize, not just feel like a writer, but recognize that you are already a writer. And I think that's the most important thing. And that got me through a lot while I was waiting to be published, is just, saying to myself all the time and doing things that made me recognize myself as a writer.
That is such excellent advice. And it was useful for me. so thank you so much, Regina. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. This has been such a lovely conversation, and I would talk to you until the cows came home.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for your wonderful attention, and thank you for liking the book.
How could you not? Thank you so much for joining us today to hear Regina and my conversation. If you haven't picked up a copy of The Coming Storm, I highly recommend that you do so. It is a very, very good book. I loved it so much, and I think that you will too. I appreciate you being here. Tell your friends about us. rate us on Apple Podcasts so that pesky little algorithm can help other people find us, and recommend this book to your rural readers, especially those who love folk stories and fantasy stories. They will be sure to love it too. Thanks for joining us this time, and we'll see you next time. So come on back now, would ya?